You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 21st of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Earlier this week, the Cook Islands in the South Pacific Ocean released details of a surprise security partnership agreement with China. The announcement has drawn protests to the island's parliament and particularly drawn the ire of New Zealand. Well, let's get the latest now with Geoffrey Miller, who is a geopolitical analyst at the Democracy Project in New Zealand. Geoffrey, good evening over there to New Zealand.
Good evening, good morning to you in London.
So before we get to China and this partnership in particular, the Cook Islands are a self-governing island in a free association with New Zealand. Tell us what that means in practice.
Yes, it's an unusual constitutional status that the Cook Islands has. It's held the status for 60 years, though, since 1965. It's actually the 60th anniversary year of the status. So officially, the Cook Islands is a self-governing state in free association with New Zealand. So Cook Islanders hold New Zealand passports, and yet, for the most part, they are self-governing. And New Zealand signed a joint declaration with the Cook Islands back in 2001 that formalised some of the arrangements. And when it comes to foreign affairs, it's listed in Clause 4 of that agreement that the Cook Islands interacts with the international community as a sovereign and independent state. So New Zealand at that point was keen for the Cook Islands to be more independent. At the same time, there's also a provision in there for consultation with New Zealand. So it's a slightly contradictory agreement.
It is when you describe sort of the need for consultation, but at the same time self-governing, even on foreign policy, which does bring us to China. The Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown visited Beijing. What is this partnership with China and how did it come about?
Yes, so Mark Brown, the Cook Islands Prime Minister, went to China last week and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Beijing. And this has not been to New Zealand's liking because of this, because of these constitutional arrangements. New Zealand very much sees it, the Cook Islands is going beyond their brief here. They think that New Zealand should have been able to see this agreement first before the Cook Islands signed it. Mark Brown points to the agreement, though, and says, well, we're acting as a sovereign and independent state. And in fact, in that 2001 agreement, there's even another provision which says the Cook Islands has the capacity to enter into treaties and other international agreements in its own right with governments. So New Zealand has some signer's remorse, you might say, over that 2001 agreement. Some of the frustrations are a little hard to fathom when it comes to New Zealand's qualms over this deal, because New Zealand also has a comprehensive strategic partnership with China that it signed back in 2014. And New Zealand has quite good relations with China overall. It's China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner. And New Zealand has cooperated with China on water infrastructure in the Cook Islands quite recently. So some of the hostility towards this agreement is a little hard to comprehend, but I think it comes in the context of this wider geopolitical competition in the Indo-Pacific, and the current foreign minister in New Zealand, Winston Peters, is pretty pro-US and pretty sceptical of China. In fact, he's yet to visit China as foreign minister, and he's been foreign minister for almost 18 months now.
Geoffrey, is there a worry as well that this kind of agreement, even if the Cook Islands was allowed to sign this, as you describe from the arrangement that they have with New Zealand, that this sort of means that there's more of a separation between the two territories, if you will, that they are going on different tracks? Is that part of what this is about?
Well, yet New Zealand and the Cook Islands both now have a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China. I would say it actually is the opposite. It's actually brought New Zealand and the Cook Islands onto the same page. Really, the reality is here that Winston Peters, the New Zealand Foreign Minister, doesn't like who the Cook Islands is signing an agreement with. The United States recognised the Cook Islands as established diplomatic relations with the Cook Islands as a sovereign state back in 2023, and New Zealand didn't have a problem with that. And if the Cook Islands were signing an agreement with Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom, I doubt very much Winston Peters would have had any issues with it. It's the fact it's with China, and when it comes to personal relationships, Winston Peters has got a very poor relationship with Mark Brown over some things that happened last year. Mark Brown, the Cook Islands Prime Minister, wanted to introduce a separate Cook Islands passport that would sit alongside the New Zealand passport. Winston Peters vetoed that, and Mark Brown also wanted to bring the Cook Islands into the United Nations as a member there, and New Zealand also said no to that. So in a sense, there's also an element of payback to what's happening at the moment. But it's been quite extraordinary over the last couple of weeks in New Zealand. Some of the statements that have been coming out of Winston Peters' office saying that the Cook Islands had improperly consulted with New Zealand, and saying that New Zealand didn't see eye to eye with the Cook Islands. It's all been quite unedifying, and hopefully now this deal has been signed. Winston Peters and Mark Brown do sit down and behind closed doors take this away from the media where it's largely been litigated, and work out their differences and find out a way forward.
And just finally, Jeffrey, the instigator of all this, with this being the partnership agreement with China, what is China's actual interest in this? What do we imagine they are thinking, watching all of this? Do they care, or will they just be looking on somewhat bemused that they've caused such a ruckus between the Cook Islands and New Zealand?
Of course. I mean, I think China probably is somewhat bemused by all of this, and perhaps they've had the desired effect here. But I think Winston Peters, New Zealand Foreign Minister, has fallen into the trap here. Now New Zealand is taking a more aggressive stance towards the Cook Islands in terms of its constitutional arrangements. Winston Peters gave a speech this week saying he wanted to reset relations with the Cook Islands and effectively renegotiate the constitutional relations that it has with the Cooks. And I don't think any of that's going to go down well. I mean, this heavy-handed approach, it comes across as quite paternalistic, quite colonial. In the end, what Mark Brown wants is money. He wants economic development for the Cook Islands, and that's what this agreement is largely about. It's about economic cooperation with China, development, infrastructure. And in the end, I think it's up to New Zealand to provide a better offer. It doesn't want the Cook Islands going off to Beijing or going off to other suitors. It needs to provide what the Cook Islands wants. So in the end, it's quite simple. Winston Peters needs to get his checkbook out and provide what the Cook Islands is looking for. New Zealand does provide grant money, but Mark Brown has been quite open, saying it's just not enough. New Zealand needs to provide more. So Pacific states, including the Cook Islands, have options at the moment because of this competition between China and the Western states, and Mark Brown is certainly using his options.
Get the checkbook out, New Zealand. Jeffrey Miller from the Democracy Project in New Zealand, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio.